Thank you so much, Shrimi, for inviting me to conduct the session. And thank you, Professor Sinha, and thank you, Binoy, and everybody else from Aryabhatta College for inviting. I sort of went to Delhi University and interacted with students and faculty to just understand this question. What are the various struggles that students and teachers have in the classroom? And this is also linked to my teaching work, because what I focus on is developing literacy skills among students. The question is, why do students struggle to read in the English classroom? And as we all say in English departments, there is no one right answer, right? There are multiple answers. There are as many answers as the number of participants today, even more, right? Now, what we'll try to do is not to get to some standardized answer. What we'll try to do is to think of certain parameters or think of a method through which we can arrive at these answers, through which we can carry out an inquiry to seek these answers, right? To spark off the conversation, we are going to do something a little different. We're going to do a role play. And I'm going to do this with Shrimi. So Shrimi has agreed to do this with me. And in this role play, we are going to enact 4 different scenarios, right? So just to give you some context. So I think for those who are from outside Aryabhatta, Shrimi is teaching this novel called In Custody by Anita Desai in her class right now. And this is a novel that people from DU would know. It's in the syllabus. And Shrimi, as the teacher, is going to ask questions to her student about the reading. And I'm going to play 4 different students just to demonstrate different types of responses and attitudes, right? And you don't need to know what In Custody is about. This can be any novel at all. What I want you to sort of think about is whether you relate to this scenario. Do you think these characters are relatable? Have you seen this happen in classrooms? How do you respond to these situations as teachers and students? So do put it on chat, and after the role play, we'll also sort of take some responses, right? So Shrimi, should we do it?
Yes, let's begin. Okay.
And just to kind of explain, I'm going to just imagine that this is a clapboard, and we go from scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. Right? So there are 4 different scenes, 4 different scenes. So let's begin.
Good afternoon, Shilpa. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Hi, ma'am.
Right. Have you been following the class discussions, Shilpa? Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you like to share your views on the portrayal of women characters in the novel In Custody? Go ahead.
Ma'am, could you repeat?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just rephrase the question for you. Would you like to talk a bit about the way women have been represented in the novel?
Ma'am, I don't know. And the text is really difficult, and I don't think I can. I don't think I can.
Okay. Hi, Gaurav. Let's hear you talk about the portrayal of women in the novel.
Who, me?
Yes, you.
Yeah, hi, ma'am. Hi.
What do you think about the way in which women have been portrayed?
Oh, the portrayal of women, ma'am. Ma'am, it's really bad, ma'am. The portrayal is bad.
Okay. It would help if you could elaborate a bit, maybe.
Ma'am, what to elaborate, ma'am? It's just bad, ma'am. I mean, it's a bad portrayal. I mean, the portrayal is bad, ma'am.
Okay. Could you cite a few instances from the text to substantiate your statement?
Ma'am, can I ask you something? I mean, what is the point of this, ma'am? I mean, why? I mean, what is the relevance of this? And ma'am, also the text is very boring, ma'am.
Right. Hi, Lavanya. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah, perfectly. Right. Lavanya, what are your observations on the portrayal of the town Mirpur in the novel?
Yes, ma'am. Thanks for the question, ma'am. Ma'am, Mirpur has been portrayed as an impassable desert and an impenetrable prison in the novel In Custody.
That's Correct, right. Could you talk about the relationship that the protagonist Devane shares with the town, maybe?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the portrayal of the protagonist Devane is synonymous with the portrayal of Mirpur as a town. He feels trapped in the town. It is a hindrance to his aspirations and dreams.
Indeed, indeed. Why do you think he feels this way?
Ma'am, why do I think he feels this way?
Why do you think Devane feels trapped in Mirpur?
Ma'am, I didn't find this in the notes that you gave me. Ma'am, I didn't find this in the essays that you suggested. And I read the novel twice, ma'am. I didn't find this answer, ma'am.
Okay. Hi, Tushar.
Hi.
I have a very specific question for you. So, Tushar, how does the destruction of Abid Siddiqui's Haveli shed a light on the state of Urdu in post-partition India?
Yes. Actually, we have to understand the politics of language for this. And we have to understand that, there were these complicated conversations in the Constituent Assembly debates, right, in post-partition India. And you see that there's an erasure of different marginalities from Hindi, and Hindi becomes Sanskritized, and
Right, Tushar. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but my question, like I said, is very specific. So I'd appreciate if you could come to the point.
Yes, ma'am, I'm coming to the point. I mean, ma'am, the point is that there is a context for this, ma'am. So you have to understand that there's a hegemony of languages, which we have to understand, ma'am.
Right, Tushar, but could you address the question at hand? The significance of the event of destruction, probably.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So I'm saying that, look, ma'am, today we have to see that there is a politics of naming and renaming, right? You see that, Urdu.
Tushar, let me ask you a different question. Have you read the novel?
Ma'am, I browsed through it, ma'am. I browsed through it.
That explains it.
Okay, so these are 4 characters, and how relatable were they? What are some of your responses as you kind of watch these characters? Any sort of response that you have? Okay, very relatable. Anything else? Like, what would you do as a teacher or student in this situation? Have you been part of these situations?
If I can, I think as a teacher, yes, they're
Yes.
absolutely relatable. All 4 characters were, because we do come across students who are, quick enough to latch onto the question, the co-question, as it were. But at the same time, we also have students who perhaps are genuinely making effort, but it really takes a while to drive them through to the question. Really to the point that we to the question that we actually want them to answer. So in that sense, they were all relatable characters. Sometimes there are students who deliberately do that. I think, but well, as teachers, we have to be patient, and we have to try and pretend that yes, they generally have not understood it, the question, and which is why they are, uh, maybe behaving the way or responding in the way in which they are. And so I think empathy perhaps is one
Okay.
that is required in irrespective of how student is responding. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, that would be my response.
Okay. Thanks for that, Vinay. Any other response? I think Srishti raised her hand.
Yeah. Hello. Thanks for that role play. Actually, it was quite interesting. I believe that there's no one strategy, obviously, but I think in the beginning 2 sessions where students were a little lost, something like narrowing down the question might help at times. If it is too broad, then students, sometimes those who have read at least, may not know where to begin from. That's something that I've seen has worked. But again, if the student has not read it, then no matter how much you narrow it down, might not come to the point that we are trying to work on.
I think Shipra, would you like to tell us? Okay, fifth is almost someone who just when asked a question exits the online meeting. Yes, and any students here, or would you like to say something about what you thought of it?
Hi, I think that there's this thing of how do you build the argument? So, for instance, we might know what the question is asking. We might even have an answer ready, but we might struggle with putting it into words or organizing it correctly and concisely.
Okay, so so now, like, there are, I mean, we showed the scenarios, and I think the responses are talking about, what actually happens at that moment, right? So you may not understand the question very well, and you don't know how to concisely put your thoughts together. And in terms of how you approach it from the teacher's perspective, you sort of show empathy, or you try to break down the question further in order to, encourage a better conversation. Now, let's take a step back, because what we are sort of trying to understand is what is the nature of the reading in each of these scenarios, right? So for example, in the first character, Shilpa, you see that there's a sense that I can't do it. So there is a loss of your own capacity, a sense of your loss of your own capacity to actually read, right? So this may manifest as a self-esteem issue, or this may manifest as this, self-labeling that, I'm a weak student and I can't really do this, right? With the second character, what you see is that there is this sense of, you find this irrelevant. Now, this can come from a place of entitlement sometimes, but this can also come from this place where you're just confused. Like, why are we reading this text, right? And if there is no sort of tangible purpose, which you understand, you're thinking, okay, why should I read this text? And this, in fact, actually opens up the questioning of curriculum itself and how a curriculum and how a syllabus is being introduced to the student. With the third student, you find that there's a lot of, this one is a diligent student, she has very textbook answers, but when she's asked to reflect, she doesn't know, because she has probably been trained in a rote learning method and doesn't know how to kind of think more reflectively and go beyond the textbook answers, right? And with the fourth student, you find that the students have picked up a jargon. And I'm sure a lot of students will relate to this, that you start picking up a jargon, but you don't really know how to use it in a more meaningful way, or how it can enable a very specific reading of the essay. Now, the reason I went through these sort of 4 scenarios, and there could be many more, is to now move on to the next part of the session, where I'm going to go through certain questions which can help build conversations in the classroom, right? To think about why do students struggle to read. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and so I'll share it first. Okay, can you see this? Okay, so this is a comic, and in this comic there are 2 characters who are students having a conversation to sort of seek an answer to this question. And some of the points that I will convey here, have been presented through this comic, but I will of course explain and elaborate on all of them. And if you want any clarifications, please sort of pause and ask at any point. Now, what we are trying to move towards by the end of the session is a more complex understanding of this question, right? Because if you're just stuck with simple answers that, it's student might say, oh, it's boring, it's difficult, it's not satisfying, because there are so many issues that are interlinked. So how can we read the different issues and read the different aspects? Now, the first sort of sub-question, right, that we can think about is, what is the reading context or situation, right? So when we ask the question, why do students struggle to read? We are asking a very specific question. We are asking that where are they struggling to read, right? Because this struggle doesn't just happen, everywhere. So think about the character Shilpa. Now, with Shilpa's character, we find that there's a default assumption that, oh, Shilpa is not able to read in the class, and that's why she's a poor reader. And if you think of it, this is a certain assumption within educational planning itself, right? You find that, okay, maybe we should have remedial classes where we can support Shilpa better. But is that going to be enough? Because there are other aspects we are not reading here. Shilpa is struggling to read a prescribed text within a certain classroom, right? Shilpa also, has a home environment where she has to, where there are some constraints or some limitations, right? So, is the home environment conducive? Does it provide Shilpa enough leisure time, right? There is also a social context within which the reading happens. Now, you find that frequently in a classroom, the kind of relationships that students have in the classroom will actually encourage or discourage a student from sort of making the effort, because the first time you're reading a text, it's difficult, right? And the struggle is important, the struggle is necessary, but you feel that, oh, I'm alone in this, and I don't know how to actually work through the struggle, right? So the relationships in the classroom, the groups you're hanging out with, all of that matter, right? Now, why is it important to have this conversation in the classroom? Because it helps us understand how each student, right, is coming from particular contexts, and how what they're reading is also within particular contexts, right? The other aspect of this is that students are also pleasurably or comfortably reading things. They may be reading comics, they may be reading jokes, they may be reading WhatsApp texts, books in other languages. And we also need to understand what is it that they pleasurably or comfortably read. And those inputs can then start helping the class as a whole build strategies for reading more effectively, right? So this is the first thing to keep in mind. What is the reading context, or what is the reading situation? The second aspect, and I think a lot of students might relate to this, which is, what is the mode of reading? Now, think about an English, and this is a question particular to the English classroom. In an English classroom, you're not just learning to functionally read, right? It's not just, I will just follow the sentence and I want to get a gist of the text. That's not what you're doing. That's functional reading, but that's not what you're doing. You're trying to arrive at critical reading. But critical reading as a term is not necessarily clarified or broken down, right? Again, a conversation that we need to build in the classroom. What is the exact type of reading that we are trying to encourage? And what are its different components, right? Now, when that doesn't happen, and usually I will sort of argue, and this is perhaps slightly provocative, but two extremes might come up. One extreme is where you don't define what critical reading is. And so everyone is trying to imitate what it is, right? So it is a slightly mysterious thing. And students are just sort of seeing that, oh, this is how the professor speaks, or this is how the quote unquote smart student speaks, right? And this is what I should instead imitate and pick up, right? And this is in fact what the fourth character, Tushar, was trying to do. Tushar wasn't actually specifically engaging with the text, but sort of providing some sort of a jargonized approximation, right? So this kind of data has not been really collected in Indian context, but in fact, there is an interesting study that was done as long back as the mid-60s in France. So Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, along with some other people, they did the study of French sociology undergraduate students. And they looked at their exam sheets and how they were writing, and they actually studied the language of it. And they tried to see how, what were they picking up on? And they saw that students were really trying hard to imitate what they thought was right, rather than actually sort of specifically engaging with the text, right? So that's one extreme, right? Imitation. You try to do what feels powerful or valid. The other extreme is where you really rely on notes and guidebooks. And what you want to get at is a standardized response, right? So critical reading then becomes very, standardized. It's a narrow sort of idea. And it's very convenient for the student and sometimes for the teacher to just say that, okay, just do this reading. This is the right answer. This is what you have to write in the exam. And in fact, with Lavanya, the third character, this is what we were trying to show. that, there's a standard, you're getting stuck with a standardized response. And of course, to understand this, we also have to think of how the educational sort of system is organized. Like there is still an emphasis on rote learning right from school, that you memorize and mug up, and a habit that you're not able to unlearn and get out of even when you come to college, right? The third thing to think about, and again, to build a conversation on in the classroom, is how reading is linked to other literacies. Now, literacy is a term that we don't use as much as we should in higher educational contexts, right? And we should. And in fact, there is now a lot of emerging work. There's a lot of work in the UK, for example. So there's a school called Birmingham School. There are scholars who are devotedly sort of studying how academic literacy and social literacies are developed in college settings, right? Now, what does that mean? So literacy, in a basic sense, you would think is language acquisition, right? You pick up sort of the skills to articulate, right? To comprehend and articulate. But that perspective is very useful because reading itself is linked to multiple other literacies: speaking, listening, and writing. So when a student is struggling to read, we have to understand that there are other capacities that has to be developed in the student, right? Listening, for one. So for a moment, think of the mental act of reading when you're reading a text. You are observing words on a sentence, you're following them, you're listening to the voice of the text, right? You are noticing transitions from one sentence to the next, and so on and so forth. So listening then is about paying attention. It's about receiving ideas, right? Without, let's say, necessarily having blocks in your head or having sort of strong biases. It's about following the thread of the conversation, right? All of which you have to do in the act of reading. Let's think of the capacity to speak. And, I would really like it if more students also speak, because what ends up happening in a lot of classrooms is that students feel they're feeling shy, right? Or because speaking is a spontaneous activity, and you assume that it requires this confidence, right? But when you read a text, why is speaking so important? It's important because you have to speak back to the text, right? Because typically, the voice of the text or the authority of the text sort of can mesmerize you, can intimidate you, can overwhelm you, and you don't find a space to actually kind of respond back, right? And spontaneously respond back. And that's also something, that's a capacity that can really help in the process of critical or dialogue-based reading. The third is, of course, writing, and there are many things to talk about, so I'll just touch upon a couple, which is that when you now focus on the act of writing, what are the things that you observe? You observe that, okay, how are sentences structured? So rather than just thinking of thematic understanding, this is the text broadly means, you're thinking that, how is the sentence structured, right? Is it an exclamatory sentence? Is it a question? And what difference does it make, right? You're thinking, what is the vocabulary doing, right? Why have these words been used and not other words? You're thinking of how paragraph transitions happen. What are the transition words used when you move from one paragraph to the next? And those are all things you'll become more alert to as you're reading. So as you struggle to read, you also have a more empowered understanding of how the text actually works, right? So these are some of the questions that can help us sort of break down sort of this larger question of why do students struggle to read. Now we come to the next part, which is then how do we answer this, right? Now, as I said, our purpose in this session is to go from simpler to more complex understandings. And we'll in fact do an exercise in a bit, and I will sort of give you some questions and I would like you to reflect on it. And the idea is that we have to now think of some parameters within which we can organize a response, right? And I'm going to suggest 3 parameters for this session, just to sort of keep it simple for this session: social, psychological, and pedagogic, right? And I'll tell you why we are going to do this. Now, if you ask a student and student says that the text is sort of, not interesting, or it's the text is boring. Now, there are other issues involved there. It is linked to, let's say, your assessment system, right? Your assessment is not, let's say, able to encourage you to read in a more reflective manner because you think that I have to prepare for standardized sort of answers in the paper. So it's linked to a pedagogic issue. As I said, it's linked to relationships you have in the class, which is also a pedagogic issue. It is related to a social setting, right? So it is a social issue. It's related to your own estimation or, understanding of yourself. Am I capable? Am I confident, right? So it becomes a psychological cognitive issue also, right? So I'm going to give you a set of questions, and I want you to think of one experience of struggling with a text, and I want you to use some of these questions to jot down some responses, right? And before we get into it, why are we doing it? Now, there are a few responses to that. One, we are doing it because we are trying to map, right, this question. We can't sort of lead towards or develop, better or solid answers if we don't map first what is actually happening to us, right? And it's a very subjective, self-reflective, process. The second is we are collaborating, because in this scenario, and I would encourage that we do have these conversations or do these exercises in different classrooms, and if there are teachers from other colleges too, I think it would be interesting to do them, is to understand, okay, how can students and teachers together brainstorm on this question, how to read more meaningfully, or why do we struggle to read, right? Third, when you start developing a more clearer and a more articulate understanding of your struggle, it builds your agency, right? It gives you the confidence, and it gives you some of the tools through which you can begin to, direct yourself, right? And finally, and this is a very important point, this is an invitation for research. This kind of research is not very common in Indian higher education settings, where we are actually trying to map, the experience of reading itself in the classroom. And once we start documenting it, that becomes the material through which we build this research, right? So now I will, so Shrimi has already sort of given you the questions, right? I'm also going to just put it up on the screen. Now, what I want you to do is, I want you to think of an experience where you have struggled to read a text, right? For students, you can think of something more immediate, what you've been struggling with in your class. For teachers, a text that you have struggled with earlier or struggling with right now. What are some of the significant aspects of this experience? And what do you think are some of the causes for the struggle? And I've given you a set of questions like social, psychological, pedagogic. Now, of course, you don't have to go through, you don't have to answer all the questions. These are just guidelines, and there can be more questions too. I just want you to think of at least one, reason from each parameter. I want you to think of a social factor. I want you to think of a psychological and a pedagogic. Psychological pedagogy is perhaps easier, it's more immediate, but also think of social factors. How is it linked to your school education and how you were trained to read? How is it linked to your social setting, right? How is it linked to the relevance of this text to your life, right? So take 2-3 minutes, and then we'll take some responses. So just jot down bullet points. So maybe just jot down one or two sort of thoughts in your head related to these questions. You can take maybe 2 or 3 questions from the total lot, or think of other questions if required. Okay, so can we have some responses now? Or do you, yeah. So anybody who wants to volunteer.
Hi, can I begin?
Yes.
Hello, Sayan. Hi.
Fine.
Okay, I'm teaching at Institute University Lucknow. I'm joining from Lucknow right now, and I just remember one of my experiences when I was in BA first year. So it was just the beginning of literary journey, and I was very excited because I was BTech dropout, so I just took a very different turn to literature, and then I joined. So I just began with the Wuthering Heights. And it was I never knew that it was such a complicated text at that particular time. And what I struggled with was the imagination. I was not able to imagine the scenario, anything. I mean, I was just able to imagine the country land, that it is very windy and it is very stormy weather and all that. But other than that, the narrative was changing very fast. And if you, I mean, all of us have read the novel. So the novel is more about flashback, and then more flashback, and then coming to the present, and then the Heathcliff, and it was so much confusing. So I just couldn't finish that novel that time. Then I watched the movie. So finally I could understand what was happening. So this was one of my struggle. The other there's one more point I would like to say. I was reading Camus, Albert Camus, The Plague, and it came out of the pandemic. Everyone was reading The Plague. I started reading this last year. I don't know what happened to me. I just couldn't finish it. Uh, I was not interested that much. There was so much philosophy, but I am interested in philosophy. There's nothing like that I'm not interested in philosophy. But I just couldn't read it, and I am not able to understand till this day that what made me stop that novel. This is the second experience, and this third thing that is not an experience. I would just like to share something. I gave a lecture in Amity University, and there I was talking about the topic of my lecture was reading act of reading in the time of Netflix. So what I wanted to talk about in that lecture was that the Netflix, and I mean, I'm not talking just about Netflix, I'm talking about everything together, like Instagram and Facebook and everything. They're all making us so much hyper sensitive, hyperactive. We need sensation at every page, which is not there in the novel. So that is happening with series and with movies in these Netflix paradigm. That is not happening with the novels. So they are growing at a very slow pace. I think that is also one of the reasons. Yeah.
I think you made very interesting points, and I'll just quickly flag a couple before we take more responses. So one is when you say the struggle to imagine, right? And I think this is a very important issue, because this leads us to the problem of how you are always reading a text from a particular social context, right? Within which there are certain visuals, certain familiar images, and the act of reading is in fact to discover something unfamiliar, right? And I think sort of, if you are aware of that, you as a student, even that, oh, this is going to be unfamiliar and something that I'm going to sort of work towards understanding. And again, looking up the context is one way in which you do it. So that's an important issue to talk about. And the other, I think it's a fascinating issue. I don't know if others will also talk about it, which is stimulus, right? Now that with this sort of social media world, Netflix, digital stimulus, is the novel providing that kind of a stimulus that you're otherwise being conditioned, to receive all the time? So very interesting points. Thank you for that. More responses, please. What are others' thoughts on this?
Shayan, am I audible?
Yes, Chinmay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm not sure if it is a text that I'm still absolutely comfortable with. But I remember that in the third year, it was a struggle to read Can the Subaltern Speak? Uh, Primarily, I think because most of the vocabulary was, I'm not so sure about my classmates, but most of the vocabulary was technical, critical, in a way that those were words and phrases and formations that I was not familiar with. Uh, that not just school. I think the first 2 years of undergrad had also not prepared me for that. Uh, the other thing was, I think I I don't want to name the person or anything. I'm just speaking generally. I think the teacher was also not able to tell us, you know, if there were ways of approaching that text. I'm not saying that as a student I expect my teacher to tell me that, this is what the text is about. But as a learner in a classroom, I want the teacher to sort of guide my processes of navigation, which I think never happened with like uh, literary theory in general, and I think the likes of Lyotard and Spivak in particular.
Okay.
And I would say, in terms of syllabi also, uh, in terms of pedagogical reasons, I'm not sure whether I'm placing this correctly, but I don't think that uh, the syllabus is structured in a way that prepares me for handling what is going to come. In the sense that uh, you to understand how Spivak critiques Foucault or uh, critiques Negri or talks about the position of the subaltern woman in 19th century Bengal. Uh, I need a I need a sort of preparatory platform. So I need to know what Foucault says about something to be able to access how Spivak critiques that. I think that was not there because I just felt that uh, I was absolutely unprepared, and I think in the MPhil I did a presentation on Can the Subaltern Speak, and it is only then that I felt that I sort of have some sort of a handle on the text.
Okay. No, I think that's a very important point. I just want to flag the point about vocabulary also, because I think that especially with theoretical literature, we have to understand that so much of it depends on a vocabulary that requires its own sort of engagement, right? For which, as you said, there needs to be a preparatory work to actually, and I don't think maybe we do it in some classrooms, we don't do it in others, just focus on words and think of their histories, their nuances, their colloquial meaning as well as their sort of more established, discursive meaning, right? So these are also sort of exercises that can really help, I think. Okay, more responses, please.
Can I go?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in my experience, again, this was doing graduation in English honors at Delhi University itself, where I believe my response is coming from a more social understanding, which was something which was related to both the setup you're born with, also what you sort of step into as soon as you go to college, where immediately what you are and this was the syllabus then. I assume it's changed a lot now, where everything is absolutely foreign, because there's this emphasis on mainly British but also other Western canonical literature, and you're supposed to suddenly be able to imagine those social settings, even though the faculty would help you at times to break down the process, sometimes make it more uh, uh, by giving some examples which you can relate with a little more, but then you feel sort of distanced from what you are reading, and thus like there's this sense of like, again, the distance that is created there is also reflected in everything that you're doing, because apparently then it becomes sort of a touchstone that if my answer is not there, it is not good enough, and that subsequently reflects in the reading that you're doing. This is something that I saw happened in my experience a lot.
Thanks for that, Srishti. That's a very important point. Can we have more student voices now? Like people, who are in their undergraduation right now. Anybody?
Yes. I think the social setting does affect the student to speak at all, because if the setting is too intimidating, that person might feel very uncomfortable to speak at all. I mean, that person might feel too conscious about that person's voice, how he or she is sounding, or like if he or she might become a matter of ridicule, or if that person speaks something wrong or stupid, like it becomes kind of intimidating. If the setting is too friendly, that person might feel very comfortable to speak anything what she or he might feel like.
Okay. So I think that's a very important point, because it has to do with like sort of, again, creating the classroom situation in a manner, that sort of encourages and enables students. But Neha, you are an undergraduate student right now?
I'm a postgraduate student.
Okay, postgraduate student. But because you're still a student, what do you think can be done? And what do you think can students do, in fact, to sort of help the situation? Okay, but think about it, because what I'm trying to get at is that, like the reason we are also sort of trying to, work through these questions is to think of, even as a student, what can I do, right? Because this task is not just up to the teacher. It is, yes, the teacher plays a very significant role, the administration plays a significant role, but so do sort of student groups themselves, who frequently kind of unconsciously maybe othering some students. And I know that as somebody who was quote unquote a more confident student, I was, early on in undergrad and even early postgrad, I was not very aware that when I spoke, I might be taking up space in a certain way, right? Or, the way I'm even looking at my fellow sort of classmates, I might be sort of exercising a certain power dynamic, which is making it difficult for those students to then sort of speak up, right? Other responses?
Hi, I relate a lot to what you just said because I was exactly like that in my undergrad. Uh, I'm doing my master's currently. As for what students can do to make an environment, a classroom environment where more people can speak up, I think it's important. I guess it's good to keep in mind that there's no beginning and no end to the discussion aspect of approaching text, right? So, for instance, somebody could say something, and then it's like somebody else could one up them, but then somebody else could one up them in turn. So, like, I mean, I think that would be an interesting way to unfold a discussion, and we can actually see how we can actually see the different ways of reading a text through that. I feel.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because I think part of what we are also trying to do here is to kind of build a dialogue, right? And I think that's, again, a culture that takes time to build. But the idea is that reading, and especially reading in the classroom, is not just an individual reading. It's reading through many different perspectives, for which you need sort of that sense of we are all adding on to each other's points. What else? Any other sort of experiences of struggle and other points?
There is a comment in the chat box, Shai. Yeah, students can be supported.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, other responses?
I think that too much emphasis is paid on the first reading, and we should get away from it as early as we can. Because if you think that you're going to get everything from the first reading, then that will increase the anxiety and tension to get every aspect of the text.
A very important point, I think that, like the first reading is not enough, and there are multiple attempts that need to happen. And this brings up the question of persistence. And again, a question that's really relevant to students. You have to try again. And I think that giving up on the first reading and thinking that, no, it's, this is not for me, is again like something that we end up doing frequently, but persistence becomes important. Okay, Rizwan is saying that I had a struggle because I feel so bored. Okay, I think Rizwan, it would help if you tell us why you feel so bored. And Harshit has sort of mentioned a bunch of things here that unable to connect the social relevance. I was only motivated for the sake of the assignment at first. I think this point that Harshit makes about annotating is also useful. I think one of the things that I didn't quite mention is that when we talk about a reading situation, a reading situation is not just a social setting; it's a material setting, right? There are, you're reading the book either on a physical copy or on a digital copy, right? You are interacting with the text with your pencil while sort of taking notes, and I think that is also something we need to map very actively, because that is really essentially a part of reading, annotating, taking notes. And I would love to know if these are things that you also struggle with. Any more responses?
Hi.
Yes, Indo.
Yeah, Shayan. So, this is something which I felt when I was enrolled for the master's program, and I figured that I'm being introduced to a literary theory a literary theorist and his theory, where I was not able to connect. So it was Paul Ricoeur's text which I was reading, and I was not able to connect these stanzas. So sorry, the paragraphs. So from shifting from one paragraph to another, definitely he is developing on a certain idea, but it was very difficult to connect the ideas which you and how he was developing upon. And I never got back to that text because it took me so much of effort and time to read that text that I never got back to. It was only through class lectures I could figure out certain important ideas that he was putting forth, and eventually understood what actually Ricoeur is trying to say in context of time.
Okay. Thanks for that, Indu. And I think with theory, that's again like an important issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are many more, so I would really love to hear from some of you. Yeah.
I'm
Abdul, you're not very audible. Could you? Hello.
Is it okay right now?
Yes, it's better.
Okay, right. So my name is Abdul. I'm from Kerala. I finished my in 2019. Problem I had.
Abdul, I think your voice is getting cut. I don't know. Can others hear? Okay, your voice is getting broken. Maybe you can put it on chat.
Is it better now?
Yeah, try speaking.
Yeah, is it better now? Like, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, there are some problems with my Wi-Fi. So the issue is the challenge I had personally while I was shifting from Kerala. In Kerala, I did my UG, and I went to do masters in DU. So there was a difference between the syllabi and the curriculum of DU and the university back in Kerala. And while I was preparing the critical essays in the exam and for my assignments, I was always worried, how to bring an authentic or better criticism, or like a how to write better than my classmates. So, and the way we appreciated a text and we never had this technical backing, I guess. Like we were more original, I feel, but then we never had that much of a deep sense of like subjective knowledge or something like that, if I can use that word. So always I think the problem of curriculum comes in, the problem of social context comes in, and yeah, a lot of factors. I mean, even pedagogy comes in there, I guess. And I remember my teacher, like my professor in Kerala, teaching me Thomas Gray's elegy, and I think that the problem was with the teacher, that I couldn't understand anything in the LG, and I went back to my hostel room. I opened the text. I took my notes. I took Google. I slowly I read it and entirely, and I was so happy that I could read myself and get the sense of the text. While the teacher almost killed that beautiful poetry totally, completely. And I thought that it's the same way happening. It's only happening with me. But when I asked with my classmates, they couldn't also understand a word out of it. So, but the teacher was struggling a lot with the text. Like I think he spent 2-3 hours on a stretch to teach the entire poem in one go. So, but when I did myself, I think I maybe the way we speak out poetry, the way we illustrate things, ups and downs, the way that we connect all matters, in reading, and there the personal part of reading. Even my social setting is like social, like we are, like reading a poem which has nothing to do with our own immediate location, right? We are reading something which is relatable, universal still, but yeah, but we make imaginations related to each other. That matters, I guess. I think that is the part where many teachers in doing literature fails in the classroom, to relate, to inspire, to make, spark, the ignite, imaginations. So yeah, I just recall this now.
Thanks for that, Abdul. And there are a couple of things I want to kind of respond to. One is about when you say that initially your struggle was to sort of realize how to do an authentic criticism, right? And
Yes.
because you think that there is a better criticism, and there might be, right? There are, that your criticism can over time develop, right? But you want to sort of do it at the first go. Whereas I think one of the approaches that we can also develop is that we develop our criticism and we develop our reading as we kind of put more and more layers over it over time, right? But the other thing is that there are multiple types of criticism. So there is this interesting book by an American scholar called Rita Felsky. It's called Limits of Critique. And she, in fact, critiques how, English scholarship in the US primarily is, in fact, following particular formulas and, in fact, standardizing what, let's say, critical thinking or critical writing means. And she suggests that no, critique can mean many things, right? And critique can, in fact, sort of bring in the subjective a lot more actively. And here, the other thing I want to say is, there is this fascinating essay, and it's a very short essay. I would encourage all of you to read it. It's called The Act of Study by Paulo Freire. So, Act of Study by Paulo Freire, I'll put it on chat also. And it's a very short, essay, just a 4 or 5 page essay. One of the things Paulo Freire says here is about when in the act of reading, let's sort of, whatever strikes us when we read a sentence, whatever reflection we have, let's file it, let's note it down, right? Rather than trying to arrive at what is the best reading, let's be alert to the constant reflections that we have as we read and keep sort of noting them, keep sort of thinking more on them. And in that he's saying, and he's making a case for subjective readings, which can be far more transformative for yourself, right? And that's also how you begin to connect the text with your life. Okay, Tanu, you have raised your hand. Do you please go ahead?
Yeah. So, this is about my recent, struggle with my PhD in primary text, right? And this is also related to the binary, that I always found in academics, as an undergrad student, where you have to distinguish between content and form, right? So my training has mainly been as an undergrad student to focus on the content, read the themes, theme pe focus karo, and not much, has been about, form like poetry, right? So as a teacher, I also struggle, with this kind of binary, how to sort of, deal with this, when teaching students, when they sort of can't relate with a certain form, right? Or, and even myself as a PhD scholar, since I work in autobiographical studies and I also deal with, translation studies. So this also, like this point about social, thing, does the language feel culturally unfamiliar? So it happens with me because I'm dealing with Dalit literature in translation. And a lot of, questions about social significance of my reading, or my attempting to critique it. And then, the feedback that I received from my supervisors, about, it needs to have more nuance, it has to be a multi-layered reading. While on the other hand, I'm still just trying to read it, and just trying to find out, okay, how do I, look at it, from the, like, the modalities of a certain idea, or to find a template of a certain idea. So to really bridge the gap, between me as a reader who's simply reading it, and trying to create a nuanced perspective, plus, the expectations, of, people, people around you, and also you see, people doing some really, breakthrough in this kind of research. So it's been really intimidating for me, like, in that sense.
Yeah, and but but Tanu, I would really like to know, when you say that there's that challenge of teaching content and form, and form is something that you feel a bit disconnected from. So how do you then, as a reader as well as a teacher, then what do you do? Like, how do you make the form, something that one can engage with and learn from?
So this is something that I've tried to took some sort of support from colleagues who have taught a particular paper, right? So for instance, if I deal with autobiographical studies, which is also my area of research, so I would like to go into the like beginnings of self sort of literature written by those about confessional writings, where how it sort of develops through broken sort of genres, and then comes into a more concrete or refined way of existing as genres as we know them today. So one is that trajectory that I normally use, especially in papers such as travel writing, which I've taught, where you begin by looking at those texts which early travel writers, and what is the distinction between travel logs. So like forms that emerge in their nascent stages, as where you do not find all the characteristics which you normally would find now in the accepted genre as such. So that is something that I do, that clarifies my confusion also with a lot of mixing up.
Thanks for that, Tanu. That was very useful. Other responses?
Hi, sir. Lakshita this side, and actually I would like to share my experience on reading a physical copy of a text and when compared to digitally reading a text. Like when I have a hard copy of a text, I feel very motivated and excited when I have to like read the book, and usually I decide to read first two chapters or of like one chapter of a book, but I end up reading like two or three chapters more than what I have thought of reading. And but when I digitally read a text, like I already have this prejudice in my mind that I'll not be able to understand anything from the text. And even I have tried like various things, like when I read a hard copy, I usually underline the quotes or the lines which I like, and I tried it doing digitally by highlighting the sentences as well, but I didn't found it useful. So what can I do to read increase my reading in like digitally reading a text, increase my interest in digitally reading a text?
No, and this is a difficult question, Lakshita, because I think that today, we find that because of the pandemic and because it's online pedagogy, we also have, from the government itself, there's more now push for blended learning, more online-based learning. So unfortunately, the future is not good for you in that sense, right? Because there's just going to be more digital reading. I think what to do here is to try to understand, one, where is it more comfortable for you to do digital reading, right? I think with physical reading, you can sort of create your own intimate space a lot of the time. At least that's how it works for me. Like I have a book and I can sort of tuck myself in a corner and do it. With a laptop, it's always like work. It's a workspace. And the other problem is that there are other distractions. There are other things happening, on the digital screen. If I'm reading on my phone, for example, one thing you could do is maybe sort of make it more interactive. I don't know if this works for other people, but when you're sort of going through the digital text, sort of also keep a notebook with you, right? And sort of keep making notes. You can also try to write some of those sentences on your notebook, but just try to make it a little more, let's say, enjoyable for yourself and more comfortable for yourself, because I think you enjoy the physical copy and the book and the sensation of sort of reading a physical book a lot more, right? So maybe that's one way to do it. And yeah, I think trying to switch off from other distractions is another way in which you can do it, because when you're reading the digital copy, I think there are too many distractions. So, but yeah, I mean, these are limited responses. I mean, maybe others can also help with this, but it's something that we have to try to sort of adapt to. But at the same time, a more structural response is that we need to make books and photocopies more widely available. I think the problem is that a lot of the essays you access from JSTOR or you access from, online websites, sometimes it can be useful, colleges to make some of these critical essays completely accessible to students. So that could be one way to also address it. Yeah. So maybe we can take 2 more responses and then we'll be wrapping up the session. So can we have more people talking?
This is not actually directly related to those questions, but I would appreciate your thoughts on these 2 things. Firstly,
Yes.
somebody told me that when you begin to learn critical reading,
Yes.
you begin to enjoy reading for pure fun less. Like that becomes less enjoyable. I personally don't disagree with this, because I feel like even after years of learning to read, my first read is always a blank slate. So I actually call my first read my 0th read, in the sense that I don't feel like I pick up anything on the first read. So I have to read something at least twice or more times. But what do you think of this? Like, do you think it makes it less fun? And secondly, if you don't mind, do you have any tips for reading Dickens's Bleak House in less than a week? Because I'm kind of in a crisis here regarding that. And I'm sorry, but I find Dickens insufferable, beyond insufferable, on account of his female characters mostly. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, second question. I'm sorry, I don't know how to respond to that. I think you have to try your best, read summaries, and just survive for now. But with regard to the first question, this is a very important question. But I have a disagreement with the question. That, we say that, when we read for fun and pleasure, and in the classroom, it's not fun and pleasure, it's like hard work. Why does it have to be just fun? Right? Why limit our emotional response to reading to just maybe, a certain set of emotions? Why can't reading be fun, sad, challenging, difficult, smooth, rough, and, all the gamut of emotions that you can possibly experience? And I think for me, that attitude is more productive, right? With critical reading, you're right. Critical reading is not necessarily, let's say, written in a, storytelling format, right? So you may not be engaging with lots of characters saying different things. So it might feel a bit dry sometimes. But I think what you can notice is the thought, right? There are ideas in that. And one way to kind of have a more emotional response to the reading is to think of, okay, what do these ideas mean? What do they mean in my life, right? Or what do they what kind of insights does it lead to? Right? And there are insights that will be painful. I remember when I read some critical texts and I started questioning, say constructs of, let's say, gender and caste. It's painful, right? It's uncomfortable sometimes, especially if you're coming from a privileged background. But it's an important experience to go through nonetheless. So, Radhika, I'd encourage that. I think to approach critical reading as well as all other readings as a very multi-dimensional emotional experience. It just doesn't have to be fun, but it can also be. So that's my response.
I agree. Thank you.
Yeah. Shoham, would you like to tell us anything? You've written a comment. Okay, so I think Shoham has sort of said something about how can we learn to take notes. I don't know if there can be a standardized response to this again, but I think it's a discussion that we need to have. I think one thing to do, and because what I'm encouraging is mapping, one thing to map is also how students take notes. So there are notes, some students take notes by just noting down keywords. Some students try to write down the entire thing the teacher is saying, right? Some students write down questions and reflections. And what we can do is we can actually compile this pool of responses of how to take notes so that we can learn from each other. So that could be one approach. In any case, I am going to now pause and we have sort of almost reached the end of the discussion. And I'll just sum up a little bit for the next 1-2 minutes because I think we talked about lots of things. The first thing I want to highlight is a method through which we were approaching the question, where we were all giving our inputs, and through those inputs, we are trying to build an argument, right? And there are many layers in that argument. There are many contestations, contradictions, right? So this is a method that I feel could be encouraged in different classrooms. You can think of when to do it. I know that as teachers in public university settings, there's also this anxiety to complete the syllabus. There's a huge curriculum, but to take out maybe sometimes 10-15 minutes in a class to just do this exercise to map student understanding, right? And why are students struggling to read? And I think that sort of, as I said, builds the material through which we can start developing interventions. The second thing I want to say is that this inquiry, what we are doing here, is ultimately leading towards thinking of solutions, right? But solutions can't be very simple, and they can't just be short term. So one solution can be that make the text more interesting by showing a film, showing a video, make it more familiar, teach vocabulary, as someone was talking about, like the challenges of reading theoretical texts. So those are immediate solutions you can do, but there are structural solutions you have to work towards. And that includes thinking about curriculum, thinking about assessment systems, and also thinking about the social communities we build in the classroom, right? And those require much longer work, and we have to start building the material to sort of do that work, right? So that's the second thing I want to highlight. And the third thing I want to highlight is the idea of dialogue, as we had today. And I really encourage that all of you sort of continue these dialogues in your classrooms and with your colleagues or with your friends. And I think that students and teachers have to do this work separately, but also together. We shouldn't just rely on teachers to be giving us the sort of, because teachers are also struggling, right? And as students, it's very important to realize that teachers are, you're managing heavy workloads. You have to do a lot of assessment. You have to teach syllabus that you don't have control over necessarily. So even as students, I think it's important that you have to understand what are some of these problems that are happening, right? Community building is something students also have to do, right? Working on yourself, working on sort of psychology is something students have to do. So these are discussions. I would really encourage students to start these discussions among themselves, right? But for teachers also, you have to start thinking about teaching methods based on the inputs you're getting from students. And finally, I will want you to also think of some of these solutions. So Shrimi, can you share this Google form